There was one little bit of rain and I could be here. So Jim, Bob Higgins.
Good morning. Today is Wednesday.
How long did you for the weekend? Yeah, a little bit of travel. Yeah, that's great. I was hosted over there a couple weeks ago. A bunch of physicians who were in leadership track at the business school. And they using that methodology. Right here. You know, the fascinating part of that is when they start telling stories about your career as a illustrative of some pro or con, and you don't recognize it until after you read the presentation and you say, hey, that's my career. It says, yeah, you were the model that we wrote this story. This case based, and so it's a very interesting dynamic that you say, oh my God, either getting too old or not paying attention. Sure. That's I'm going to share some of our ideas on Sure. We appreciate our leaving us here and going to back to the hospital. And the surgeons it's the whole group of surgeons that are trained there. You remember that group, and so they have to their tank. And then they do portraits and announcements and everything. Oh, yeah, I mean, yeah, real good. Love working. So I'm a but it'll be a yes, parallel. Good morning, sir. How are you? How are you? Yes. Hi, Bobby. Hello. Well, I'm not a member of the class, but I checked the. Oh, I didn't train her, but I got invited in on chair. I was there for. Nope, anybody, the only members are. And then special. 140 years. So I got it. Pass. So yeah, so when you were there, White Sox was insurance. Maybe with Baltimore City Hospital. But you know, it's one of those transfers, the man is. I mean, it's kind of more. You know, honestly, it's really whole project. That's great. That's really good. Good to see you. Where's your grandson?
And January. Then you put your permit. Sure. Yeah.
I don't think Joan is going to be here, so I think someone is pitch hitting for the.
I think we can lose the masks.
All the mics are hot.
Yeah, so we'll continue that conversation as part of the discussion. See, get off. Yeah, they're live.
I think somebody else.
So are you a baseball fan?
There's gotta be a way.
No, I don't think, I think they're,
You're right.
yeah.
Please don't go on to you.
You know what? They do.
Good.
That works. I know.
No.
Yeah, so high on this. That's all I can say. French and
Next to you on your left or your right?
Yeah, we'll do that
Just wanted to say hello. Murray Levin, how are you? Because, as you know, Jim and I are classmates.
Yes.
So that's why I'm here. I'm here with my Murray Levin. How are you, Bob? Actually, much better, thank God. We brought our daughter and our grandson. She's now 5 years post-stem cell, and thank God she's over a lot of the, she had a bad time with graft versus host, and she's over that for the most part, thank God. Immunosuppressed, but finally making antibodies against COVID after 2 regular shots and 3 boosters. But she's 5 years post-stem cell, as you both remember, when I was an intern, the career prognosis would have been 6 weeks at best. You know, well, when I was an intern, we didn't have chronic dialysis too, and I had more chronic dialysis patients in my day than most people have had. So it's a lot has changed, thank God, for the better in medicine. What's for the worse in medicine is the administrators. Are you an administrator, Bob? What do you do? Oh, well, that's okay. Then you still remember what it's like.
I still miss it.
No, I'll tell you,
I wonder what the hell I was thinking.
when an administrator once told me that I had to change the way I did things in making return appointments for my patients, I looked at her and I said, over your dead body. That was the end of that conversation. You know, they were my patients. You come back on such and such a day on such and such a time. No, the people at the front desk were supposed to tell them when to come back. Not with people with creatinine of 3.5. That's my job.
Were you looking out for the patient?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I had it all done.
Since you're here, count on vigorous dialogue.
Have you ever known me to shut up? Jim Joslin and I are classmates. So he's the one who got me involved with Lown until unfortunately Cindy got sick, and then I couldn't partake in it.
Thanks. Great to see you. Great to meet you.
Great to meet you. And is Peter Banks still active? He's supposed to be here.
No. I've only been to break it for the last 7 months.
Oh, okay. Where were you practicing surgery?
I was at home.
Oh, okay.
Surgeon.
Did you know Beryl Rosenstein?
I know the name.
Beryl and I were.
Hi, everyone. Sorry, we're not getting started yet, but there was a bag left downstairs in the restroom with some belongings in it. So if it's yours, I'll just be like right in the back if you want to come find me. Thank you.
Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
We're back live.
Yeah.
I was a senior resident of the Brigham. Went to Martin, still around. Just got back from the division 2 years ago. And then interned. Yes, and the big change between those 2 years was speech
Wow. Cutting edge. Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And you measure the pressure.
Yeah. Yeah.
So by having
Amazing. Yeah,
Well, the light
it's a little
doesn't
different
work
now.
either.
Yeah, we're actually trying to revive a lot of those old pictures and put them, around the medical center. Oh, really? I'd love to. Yeah, I'd love to. Sure. Love to learn more. Yeah. We just published a history of Johns Hopkins surgery. 140 years. Love to. Okay, yeah, sure. It'd be great. That's fascinating.
We'll send the book plates later. That one's gonna work. That's okay. But let's give them both as well. We want to make sure. So are we ready to get underway? Everyone can hear back there well enough? Okay. Well, welcome to you all. To you intrepid souls, surviving members of the college class of 1957, and our guests as well. Without the usual teleprompter to rely upon here, I hope you won't be offended if I rely on my notes for these opening remarks. This way, the staff won't have to fill in the gaps for what I've forgotten to say or walk back from and reinterpret something that I misstated. We've seen that enough these days. This is our 13th, if you've been keeping track, quinquennial gathering of the past 65 years. And the reunion planning group, which I'll introduce to you shortly, hopes this two-day session helps inform, entertain, and helps you all reconnect as well. To start with some current demographic information about the college class of 1957, which you may be aware of, but I'll repeat. There were some 1,180 of us who registered at Memorial Hall in that fall of 1953. As far as we can determine, there are about 580 of us left and remain. And there are about 165 of us, the names of which you'll see soon in the memorial service this afternoon, remain or have died since our 60th reunion, 165 of us. And 52 of us are what Harvard terms as lost. That's Harvard speak for an alum who they don't know how to reach for fundraising purposes. The names of those who've departed we will see this afternoon, and I hope you all can attend the 4 o'clock memorial service. And as you can determine, this is a different Harvard College from the one we left 65 years ago. It's rated #1 university in the country by the Wall Street Journal these past 5 years in its annual survey. Harvard today is the 4th largest corporate enterprise in the state of Massachusetts. To support the global academic efforts of the university's 21,000 degree candidates, as well as keep in touch with the 400,000 alumni throughout the world, it employs 18,000 people, of which only 2,400 are actual instructional faculty. Kind of a interesting ratio there, and one I think which John Dowling would have some thoughts about, maybe not right immediately. The university's annual operating budget exceeds $5.3 billion with a B, 40% of which is covered by a 4% annual draw from the corporation's $53 billion endowment. The administration manages and maintains 70 different libraries around the world and 650 buildings. If I'm getting too much in the weeds here, don't worry, I'm going to stop right now. Occupying 25 million gross square feet of space. One of which is the Applied Science Center building, which you have a chance to see this afternoon as you take the bus tour. which cost a princely sum of $1.1 billion to put in the ground. So it's a different place. And if you're going to take the bus tour, how many are thinking of taking the bus tour? Could you show us hands here? So it's about 20 people, it looks like, yeah, roughly speaking. So much for the numbers. I'd like to take a minute or two to single out and thank some of our classmates who since September have labored in the trenches to arrange the activities that you're going to be part of today and tomorrow. Importantly, thanks to David Epstein. Is he here today? Not yet, maybe. All right. Who took on the task of organizing and producing the series of 8 class Zoom sessions offered throughout the year leading up to today. Those virtual presentation topics varied from defense of democracy, which David Scudder did as well, and to David Epstein's own classical Trojan War playlet, dramatizing whether negotiations and mediation might have avoided the confrontation in Greek classical literature that we know so much about, and obviously the Russian-Ukrainian war. Thanks to John Dowling as well, our remaining active faculty member, who helped us shape the Zoom calls throughout. And our thanks also to our other classmates who participated, too many to mention here, in the 8 sessions which we produced during the course of the year leading up to this. We had an average of 60 people attending those Zoom calls, one which we had 90 on the line as well. And thanks also to Gottfried Brieger, though he's not here today, had to bow out because of COVID, but for his beautiful ode, I think, to the class also of 2057, which you will have copies of if you haven't already got them. But think of Gottfried, who arrived at the age of 11 on a Hudson pier on a ship from Amsterdam, 1,000 other parentless children, 11 years old, not speaking a word of English. And then he turns around and takes the English language and forms it the way you have it in his ode. Quite an extraordinary accomplishment, I think, anyway. You should also know that our Los Angeles resident classmate, Al Williams, has taken a great deal of responsibility for organizing the events of today. In addition to proposing the topic for and arranging and moderating the seminar, which follows shortly, this morning you'll hear Al's and Vic Rodney's trumpets as well throughout the day. And our call to action from Al will come regularly, and his participation as a member of our 4-man 65th reunion planning group was really very, very much appreciated. He's organized the jazz concert tonight at Scullers, and he's brought in a piano player from New York and part of the Berkeley faculty, music, and he's doing it all on his own. It's a gift from Al to our class. Thank you, Al, for doing that. I'd also like to thank a member of our 4-man reunion committee, our class marshal, John Samorian, who's not here today again for COVID reasons, although he may be here tomorrow. John has got a reputation, at least amongst people who've gotten to know him recently, of being sort of our go-to negotiator when difficult matters in the class come up. He negotiates daily with the Teamsters Union in his ownership of a trucking company, so he's well qualified for that particular role. And I'd also be remiss if I did not thank our other member of the planning committee, classmate Newt Heislip here, for all he's done in the overall guidance and management, communications and interface and process with the HAA staff, as well as create much of the email material that you've received throughout the year. It may have my name on it, but you can be sure that Al is behind it, not Al, but Newt's behind it. He was a professor of infectious diseases at Tulane. And so he's going to brief us later on the COVID protocols here when he steps up next year. And he was also the chief editor of our 60th reunion class essay book, which I think everyone would agree was a real achievement. It only took him 2 years to do it, but thank you again, Newt, for doing that. And finally, at least my part of this, in the second booklet that you received, you were given either at the desk at the hotel or here this morning. You're going to find a preliminary draft of the preface and first chapter in which some of us have been involved in a project that has to do with Dr. John Finley. Interestingly enough, there was never a full-fledged biography ever done of Dr. Finley. You would have expected someone would have done that very, very early after his death. But this, the deceased classmate Nellie Aldridge had to abandon because of ill health. And Konstantin Valhuli has taken it over. Konstantin is right there. He's joined us here come over from Stockholm, where he is presently. And he's very interested in anyone who might have had experiences with Dr. Finley they'd like to relate to him. He's throughout the reunion activities, you'll find him with us here in places like this or in other places. And even tomorrow morning at 7 a.m., we'll be sitting at the hotel breakfast room and ready to join with anyone who wants to come in, sit down with us and maybe discuss what they remember about Dr. Finley. To this point, Konstantin, and it's in draft form, has assembled roughly 650 double-spaced pages of text and illustrations, and he's preparing to present that to an editor shortly for publication sometime in the fall, we think, we're hoping for. That's still, yeah. So enough for this. Newt's going to step up here shortly, but let me thank also, I don't know if she's here, Abby Hilton, who's been our contact at the HAA. She's done this under unusually difficult circumstances. The HAA has not been in their office for the last 2 years. So it's all been done virtually and remotely. And also to Diane McDonald, who rushed to get our book out here. And even though it's late, and the reason was the paper stock was not available to print. That's one thing that COVID we probably haven't learned about or realized. Paper mills all shut down when COVID intervened. And it took a long time to get them up and running again, and the same kind of print paper that we've used in the book since then is now available, and she just got them here for us very short. Right. Anyway, Jack Cashman worked with Diane as well on this. Anyway, enough for mine. Newt, step in, and thank you for all the work you've done.
Good morning. Can you all hear me?
Good morning.
No, you need to have it turned up a bit louder. Can we have it turned up a little bit? Okay. First of all, as always, thanks to Jim for putting us all in this room, and also for those of you who are out there in video land, welcome. This morning's program is very interesting, and we will talk about that in just a moment. The COVID recommendations are when we are indoors, if we're not in separate areas, which is the big room here, you can spread out. It is, unless you're a speaker, please wear your masks. But if you're with other people that don't need masks, that's okay. At dinner, it's also recommended that we have our masks on between bites. But we're in Cambridge, but that's important because we're all in the risk group by age, if nothing else. So this morning we have this very special program, and unfortunately 2 of the people who were supposed to be on the program are not here, but we have 3 outstanding people who will be talking to you. I would like to just make a few remarks first about one of the people who is here, who is not here, I should say, and then Al will speak about Dr. Reed. Originally, Dr. Kenneth I. Shine, our classmate, was going to be on this program, and unfortunately, he is not able to be here. And Ken was going to be on the program because of his tremendous impact on medicine. And we have two giants from our class who had a huge impact on medicine, Ken being one and Al Davis being another. Ken wrote in his essay for the essay book a piece called Healthcare, Past, Present, and Future. And I'm going to read you a couple of excerpts from it because it sets the scene and also tells you something about what Ken's thoughts are and also how they became a reality. He starts out with polio. He says, in the late summer of 1955, during one of the last poliomyelitis epidemics in Boston, when the power failed, I was a volunteer on a ward at the Massachusetts General Hospital, which cared for 12 to 15 pregnant women in drinker tank respirators. The respirators were used for individuals whose central respiratory system had been damaged by poliovirus. The pregnant women and their families were committed not only to the survival of the mother, but especially that of the baby. Suddenly one afternoon, and Ken was a student at Harvard College at this time, volunteering during the polio epidemic, at 3 p.m., the power failed. The drinker respirators depended upon electricity to function. Emergency generators immediately began operating, but they served only outlets in the corridors. The nurses began to wheel the respirators into the corridor as quickly as possible to reestablish power, and the emergency search for extension cords was undertaken. My responsibility was to hand crank each respirator 3 or 4 times in order to ventilate the patient until power could be restored to their machine. I raced around from drinker to drinker, terrified that one of the patients might die from lack of ventilation. Fortunately, power was reestablished without serious complications. It was my fledgling introduction to emergency care. That same year, 1955, Jonas Salk introduced his new vaccine. Polio was eradicated from the United States in 1979, and in the Western Hemisphere shortly thereafter. Efforts to eliminate the last vestiges of polio in the rest of the world continue today. The enormous, expensive, and inefficient tank respirators were rapidly replaced by positive pressure respirators. I have had the opportunity on a number of occasions to speak to medical audiences about advances in healthcare. When asked if anyone has seen a case of acute poliomyelitis, no more than 1 or 2 older physicians raised their hands. Ken went on to become a medical resident, intern and resident at the Mass General. He developed a very early interest in healthcare from the cardiac perspective and went on to become a cardiologist. His first experiences were looking at death from heart attack. In those days, those of us are old enough to remember the Eisenhower heart attack. Otherwise, people stayed in bed for over a month after a heart attack. Those people who were Eisenhower because he had a job to do were only in bed for 2 weeks. Today, it's a completely different story. Ken went on to research the treatment of heart attacks when he became chief resident of medicine at the Mass General in 1968. And then he did a cardiac fellowship. And he was looking at these questions of outcome in terms of the outcome of bed rest for such long periods of time. It had its own complications, so forth. He then became interested in oncology as he moved up the ranks, and he became chief of medicine at UCLA. But early on, he had an experience where he was dealing with a patient at the time on Hodgkin's disease. There was no treatment for it. And young people died from it because it was a disease very commonly of young people. And he describes being an intern at the MGH with a 25-year-old patient who was being treated for end-stage Hodgkin's disease, which was ablative, basically chemotherapy. It was before the days of staging, before the days of splenectomy and so forth. And his patient turned to him as he was injecting medicine into her IV line with a question, and she said, "Am I going to die?" And he said, "I was rather shaken. She was younger than I." And the intimacy of the relationship in the darkened room caused me to pause with a rush of adrenaline. I thought of all the usual platitudes about our desire to do everything we could to help her. Instead, I responded, "Why do you ask?" Without hesitation, she indicated she was a school teacher with a class of 12 deaf children in Connecticut. She said the students were doing quite well, and if she were going to die, she would like to write to each of them a letter encouraging them to continue their studies. "Do you think it's time to write those letters?" she asked. I said, "Yes, it would be a good thing to do." And over the next 2.5 weeks, she read to me sections of these letters as I was giving her medication. And then she died. I learned an enormous amount from this patient. First and foremost, not to insert my own anxieties or thoughts about pivotal questions, but rather to try to really understand what the patient wanted to know. Second, to realize that the objective of the patient was often to discover information that was in fact not a direct response to questions. Throughout my career, when patients have asked me whether they were going to die, I've always responded, "Why do you ask?" By the time AIDS came, Ken was in UCLA and at the beginning of the epidemic, and there was a lot of concern about, like today, as we've just been through with COVID, what are the facts? Changing information. What about the virus? What about resistance? What kinds of prophylactic steps should be taken? And he then went on to become very interested in assessing healthcare delivery. So instead of looking at the biology of heart disease, which is what he was doing early on, that issue of practical application became his thesis as he went forward. He said he'd always been interested in the way healthcare was delivered, and his interest peaked early when, as a medical student, a Harvard medical student by the name of Michael Crichton approached me and some other residents to let him know when certain patients were admitted. It was his intention to follow these patients through their care. We accommodated Crichton, who then wrote a book called 5 Patients, documenting their experience. The book is very reasonable and provides insight as to what could be done at that time for care of the 5 conditions which he described. The particular note was his analysis of healthcare costs. A day at the Massachusetts General at that time cost approximately $80. Crichton suggested that it would go as high as $100 a day and provided an explanation as to why the cost was so high. He also speculated that costs might rise to as much as 6% of gross domestic product in the United States. Michael Crichton went on to write a very distinguished literary career, starting with The Andromeda Strain and a whole series of other science fiction books. He clearly had an uncanny ability to understand the possibilities and implications of science and technology for good and evil. However, his estimates on healthcare quality completely missed the rate of change, which has brought us close to 18% of gross domestic product and an average cost of hospitalization that approaches $17,000. So Ken then went on to become the head of the Institute of Medicine. And his first major effort there was looking at the quality of care and quality of care research at the Institute of Medicine. And his first effort was reducing medical errors, which of course was also oriented towards identifying medical errors. He started with a roundtable and then a committee which produced 2 early publications. The first one, To Err is Human, which was published in 1999 and identified the extraordinarily high number of errors made in the American healthcare system and the need to substantially improve patient safety. It was followed by a report called Crossing the Quality Chasm, which was a more profound, in-depth assessment of the quality across the system. I won't go through the details of all of that, and Al will be addressing some of those points. So ultimately, Ken's career then went from the Institute of Medicine to building medical schools. Why not? He was asked by the Texas system to go and help design medical care education in medical schools, but ultimately ended up helping to design the Michael Dell School of Medicine. He also was a consummate politician. He knew how to deal with all of the various people that he came across with and leave them feeling positive. And therefore, he was able to get a great deal done. So I will just summarize statement by reading this brief part about his biography. Kenneth Shine, MD, after graduation from Harvard Medical School, trained at the Massachusetts General Hospital, the University of California in Los Angeles, and then joined the faculty in 1971, ultimately becoming Dean of the School of Medicine and Provost for Health Sciences at UCLA. In 1992, Dr. Shine was named President of the Institute of Medicine in the National Academy of Sciences, now the National Academy of Medicine, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization chartered to advise the federal government on health science and health care. He addressed the quality of care in America with the landmark reports To Err is Human in 1999 and Crossing the Quality Chasm, a new health system for the 21st century in 2001. After 11 years in Washington in 2003, Dr. Shine became Executive Vice Chancellor for Health Affairs in the University of Texas System with responsibility for 6 health campuses. He spearheaded a project called Code Red, the critical condition of health in Texas, and had laid the groundwork for 2 new medical schools in Austin and South Texas. He also served as professor of medicine in one of those schools at Dell Medical School in Austin. He's been married to Carolyn Lois Shine, retired high school mathematics teacher for 63 years. They have 2 children, Daniel and Rebecca. Thank you, Ken. All the best to you and Carolyn. And let's turn to a brief introduction of our other giant from the class of 1957 in medicine, and that's Dr. Richard Allen Williams. He also has a wonderful chapter in the essay book called My Lifetime of Pride and Prejudice Before, During, and After Harvard. And I recommend that you read it. It is online as well as hopefully in your library. He talks about going to Harvard. He talks about adapting to a system where he was recruited as an excellent athlete, an excellent musician, and an excellent mind, all of which he succeeded in doing. I'm just going to read a couple of excerpts here. And the first one is Life After Harvard. He said, I graduated from Harvard with honors in 1957 and went on to medical school at the State University of New York downstate, internship at the University of California, San Francisco, internal medicine at the University of Southern California, and cardiology fellowship at the Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard Medical School, where I subsequently joined the faculty under the late George Widmer Thorne, who was also my chief. He encouraged me to follow my interest in health problems of Blacks by writing my first of 9 books, the 900-page textbook of Black-related diseases, which was published by McGraw-Hill Book Company in 1975. It was only the second medical textbook ever published by an African-American. Dr. William A. Hinton, a professor of Harvard Medical School, was the first. He goes on to describe some of the other activities that he had, including activities not related to medicine as a clinician, but another organization that he founded was the Association of Black Cardiologists, which he started in 1975 to address inequities in cardiovascular care between Blacks and whites. One of the things that stimulated me, he wrote, was to form this organization was the fact that Blacks were being misunderstood by whites in medicine. And there were demeaning publications and peer-reviewed medical journals stating that Black patients did not experience chest pain as whites did because Blacks lacked the intellectual capacity to perceive pain. In his book, The Philadelphia Negro, the eminent alumnus W.E. Du Bois was the first to study a Black community in the United States. And his later essay, The Talented Tenth, in the book, The Negro Problems, 1903, focused on a mythical subset of Blacks whom he felt should be selected for classic training as an elite cadre of Blacks to be leaders in our society. He writes, I may have been an unknowing member of this group. I can point to my career and the numerous accomplishments that have accrued to my credit with the feeling that I have disproved Professor Pittram's Farooq's pronouncements about the intellectual deficiencies of Blacks. I often say I now have more yesterdays than tomorrows, and that it is important for me not to rest in my laurels, but to continue to push for more positive change in the limited time that I have left. And finally, he says, future generations will look back on this time to determine if being Black in America has continued to be a condition that incites prejudice, as it did for me and my patients, who in the final analysis may be said to have been better than I was because they survived so many more abuses than I did and emerged from their experiences with the utmost dignity. They are my heroes, and whatever I am is completely attributed to their example. I am also confident that although there is still ill will in the world, as Dr. King stated, the arc of the universe is long and it eventually curves towards justice. Keeping this in mind, I firmly believe that we shall overcome. So to summarize then from Dr. Williams' biography, Richard Allen Williams, MD, Fellow of the American College of Cardiology, Fellow of the American College of Physicians, current president of the National Medical Association, is clinical professor of medicine at UCLA School of Medicine, and president and CEO of Minority Health Institute in Los Angeles. A graduate of the State University of New York Downstate Medical Center, he trained in internal medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, and Los Angeles County USC Medical Center, and in cardiology at Harvard Medical School and Boston's Brigham and Women's Hospital. While at Harvard Medical School, he successfully initiated the first recruitment of minority medical trainees to Boston hospitals. Following specialty training, he became assistant medical director at the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Hospital in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, California. Recruited to West Los Angeles VA Hospital as chief of the heart station and coronary care unit, he rose to chief of cardiology. A founder in 1974 and former president of the Association of Black Cardiologists, he's also a founding board member and former chair of the Institute for the Advancement of Multicultural and Minority Medicine. Author of textbook of Black-related diseases, his latest book is Blacks in Medicine, Clinical, Demographic, and Socioeconomic Correlations. He has received numerous awards, which are described in the brochure, as well as the biographies of the distinguished guests that we have this morning, I should say. Al, thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My fellow classmates and maybe a few other people who have come in. This is an historic occasion, and I'm sure that you feel it just as I do. I first want to comment on some things that Newt just brought up. First, the wonderful accolades that you gave me. I hope that I'm deserving of them, but I also wanted to comment on the accolades that you gave to Ken Shine, which are well-deserved. Ken and I have had many interactions over the course of our careers since we both graduated from Harvard in 1957. And I've always admired his career and looked at him as a leader in regards to my own ambitions. Particularly noteworthy was the what Newt mentioned regarding Ken's leadership at the Institute of Medicine and the important publications that came out of that, particularly the Crossing the Quality Chasm publication, which had to do with focusing on quality improvement in healthcare. That was a quantum leap in regards to making advances in the field of healthcare. And no one should be surprised that Ken Shine was the person who led that particular attempt. Following what Ken did at the IOM, there was a publication of another report in 2003, which I think was the year that Ken left the IOM. And that was what we called the Institute of Medicine report. I don't want to go on and on about that, but that was really the beginning of our intensive interest in what we now call healthcare disparities, and really got us off the dime from the standpoint of calling out the problems in medicine that have to do with institutional racism. And so 20 years later or so, we're dealing with that now. And we come to this point where we're going to be discussing some aspects of not only institutional racism, but also what we call health equity. The title of our symposium today, I think, belies all of that, in that we're calling attention to what I call a crisis in healthcare delivery. And that has to do with the fact that we really don't have equity in healthcare delivery, which is responsible for not only a great deal of morbidity, but mortality, loss of life, and loss of money, income, productivity, and so forth. And so today we're going to address some of those issues with our panel and try to bring to your attention the tremendous problem that we're trying to deal with in this country. Before we get into that, I want to call attention to the fact that a lot of what we're saying today emanates from our interest in what this country has gone through over the past few centuries regarding slavery and its aftermath. And you all are aware of the fact that our wonderful president, Larry Bacow, recently released what is called the Legacy of Slavery report. If you haven't read that, you need to read it, because it calls out a lot of things that not only Harvard was involved in, but the entire nation was, and the importance of slavery and its impact on healthcare delivery as we're experiencing it now. So even though I won't be talking particularly about that report today, that report serves as a background for everything that we're talking about today regarding health equity, because all of these concerns really emanate from that horrible evil of slavery a little over 400 years ago. I'm going to be the first speaker on our panel, and I'm going to try to do that expeditiously if I can. My talk is hopefully going to be somewhat brief and intense, but it's going to be focused in three particular areas. The first area will be what I call my personal journey, just to give you a few ideas of what I've gone through in trying to achieve, so to speak, and healthcare in medicine, and serving as, I guess you might say, an example for others who have followed, because I've achieved a number of what you might call firsts for a Black person in medicine. And I'm proud to have done that. But that pride doesn't serve me very well if I don't look at it as something that would engender some help that those coming after me have been given through my example. So I'll begin simply by saying that a lot of what I'm going to allude to is represented in our red book, which Jim Joslin has been the wonderful person who has produced that for our class. And I'm sure that all of you are aware of it. If you're not, you need to look at it, read it. There are excerpts from several of our lives and careers that are meaningful. And mine in particular has a lot of information which I can't talk about today, but I'll simply allude to. When I was your classmate back in 1953, I arrived on campus not knowing anything about this wonderful institution and what I was going to be confronted with. I was admitted to Harvard at the age of 16 and started matriculating at 17. And fresh out of Wilmington, Delaware. There was a culture shock to me because of the fact that all of my education, K through 12, had been in Black institutions, elementary school, high school, et cetera, middle school, high school, and so forth. And so it was a shock to me to have two white roommates in Matthews Hall. It was a shock to them as well, cultural shock, because they hadn't encountered that before. But we got along fine together, and we learned a lot from each other. I'm going to kind of jump to some other things that happened during my time at Harvard, which had to do with the fact that I think a lot of people didn't know how to deal with me. I was not necessarily a rarity as a Black person on the Harvard campus, but somewhat unusual. And from the standpoint of social activities, I really didn't have much involvement. I didn't get invitations to go to the beer blasts and so forth. But that was fine. You know, I wanted to use the time to study anyway. And we got along fine, met several friends who made it easy for me to socialize on the campus. And I met several folks who were instrumental to my career and my thinking. Ken Shine, in fact, was one of them. He and his roommate, Eddie, were inspirations to me because I could sit down and talk to them about a number of things other than just the academic stuff. And is Emil Chi here today? Emil was supposed to be coming in from the West Coast. He was a buddy that I hung out with a great deal on campus. And so we were able to get through a number of the confrontations that I dealt with as a Black person on the Harvard campus. Fast forward to medical school and to internship and residency, suffice it to say that life was not easy in any of those stops, at any of those points. Mike Klein, my associate at Brigham and Women's, we called it Peter at Brigham at that time, knows of some of the things that we all encountered in that setting. And it led to my being inspired to look at healthcare problems of minorities, because there didn't seem to be any particular concern or regard for that at that time. And so it led to my getting a great deal of help from Dr. George Thorne, our leader at Brigham. And it led to my producing this book, which is called The Textbook of Black-Related Diseases, which Dr. Thorne got published for me through McGraw-Hill, which is his publisher for Harrison's Textbook of Medicine. I was very gratified for that, because without his help, this book could not have happened. The importance of the book was that it focused on health problems of Blacks as the principal minority at that time in the United States, and brought to the attention of many people some of the problems that folks, including me, did not know existed. We now know that there's a particular need to emphasize health problems of African Americans and other minorities. And so that I feel was one of the things that came out of all of those deliberations. And really fast forward to the present time, I've recently completed my 9th book on subjects that have to do with healthcare for minorities and healthcare reform and all of those sorts of things, with this book, which is called Blacks in Medicine. Newt alluded to it earlier, which I was very happy to produce. And it's a 5,000-year compendium of the Black experience in medicine going back to the times of Imhotep. I want to now turn to my formal presentation for the next 10 minutes or so, if we can start my slide deck. Yes. So I call this historical, clinical, and sociocultural perspectives. How do I change it? Okay. In medicine, focused on achieving health equity for Blacks, African Americans, and other underrepresented minorities, or URM. I'm going to bypass all of that stuff because Newt has laid it out pretty well. And I want to show you this slide. My friend Emil Shi is not here, I guess, but he would be proud of the fact that I studied Mandarin for a period of time, fascinated by the Chinese language. And one of the things that I culled from that language was this particular expression. It's called Weiji, which in Mandarin means crisis, which is a combination of danger and opportunity. John F. Kennedy used it in a speech in 1959. And it's a good little symbol because of the fact that at least at the present time, we can say that it symbolizes what's happening with us right now in regards to dealing with the pandemic. Pandemic is certainly a crisis situation, but it also, even though it embodies danger, it offers us an opportunity to deal with some other issues by unmasking, for instance, all of the healthcare disparities and disproportionalities in regards to the impact of health problems in certain areas of the population. So that's the reason that I put that in there. I've talked about my personal journey, and I'm just going to give you a brief tidbit on the ancient history of Blacks in medicine, starting really with Imhotep, who 5,000 years ago lived in Egypt and was recognized as the first doctor in the history of medicine. He was also deified. A lot of us would hope that that might happen to us. I don't think, Mike, what do you think? In any event, he has been an inspiration for a lot of us, but particularly those of us who are African Americans or Blacks in medicine, to know that a Black person was the first person recognized as a doctor in the history of the world. Fast forward to the intermediate history, and I've already alluded to the ravages of slavery, and that being the origins of healthcare disparities. This particular slide, which you may not be able to see very well, depicts Dr. J. Marion Sims, who is called the father of American gynecology, examining a slave girl during slavery, during the times of slavery, and doing public gynecological examinations and experimentation on her. Absolutely horrible. There was no respect at all for Black women or men, and this epitomized that. And I think that these are kinds of things that people need to know about, because Dr. J. Marion Sims, who went on to become, for instance, the president of the AMA, was accepted by white medicine as a champion and a hero because of the experiments that he did and the results that led to some advances in gynecology, but at the expense of these people who were subjugated to his work. I can't give you intimate details about these other gentlemen that you're going to see now, but these are all doctors, early doctors, Black doctors in our history. The one on the my far right in the military outfit is Dr. Delaney, who was actually the first Black student at Harvard Medical School in 1850. He didn't finish Harvard Medical School because of the fact that he was thrown out at the behest of the students who didn't want to study with him. And long story there, which you can read about in my book, but that I think served as an example of the discriminatory practices in education that were going on. So even though Blacks had a hard time treating themselves or getting treatment, they decided that they needed to establish some institutions of their own. And the first two that were established were Howard University College of Medicine in Washington, D.C. in 1868, and Meharry Medical College, I think about 1872. Along the way, up through 1910, about 11 Black institutions of medicine, medical schools were established. But at that time, there was a report which came out after some investigation that led to the disestablishment or the elimination of all of the Black medical schools in this country, except for Howard and Meharry. That led to diminution of the numbers of Blacks who were able to be trained in medicine. And that deficit still exists to this day, to the point that less than 4% of the doctors in the United States are African American. These are some of the earliest Black doctors and slave doctors in America. The ones on the left are the ones who are the MD, including Dr. Lucas Santabay, who was recognized as the first Black doctor to practice in the United States, and many others, including Dr. Martin Robinson Delaney, who I told you was the first Black doctor, the first Black student at Harvard Medical School. Never got his MD from Harvard because he was ejected, but did finish through preceptorship after that. And the ones on the right are what we called slave doctors, who were very outstanding. I wish I had more time to tell you about them, but I'll just mention one of them. He's the gentleman at the top of the list named Onesimus. And he actually was a slave here in Boston. Yes, Boston did have slaves. And in the 1700s, there was a smallpox epidemic in Boston, which Onesimus actually helped to eradicate because of the fact that he developed through his boss, who was Cotton Mather, a Harvard professor, a vaccine for the smallpox, which was tremendously effective. And it was really the first vaccine developed in the United States. No matter what you think about Jenner and all of the things that you read about in the regular medical history books, this man was the first, you probably know about this, to develop a meaningful, useful vaccine. And he was a slave. Long story about that. The people of Boston who were benefited by this didn't take kindly to it. And in fact, they stormed Cotton Mather's house and tried to burn it down because they heard that this slave, this heathen, had developed this cure, so to speak, or prevented for smallpox. Well, a lot more could be said about that, but move on to what I call the era of Black medical autonomy. I'm showing here the picture of an organization that I've been privileged to head. It's just called the National Medical Association, which consists of about 40,000 African-American physicians. It's the largest Black medical organization in the world. And this was at the National Convention in Boston in 1909. This organization was formed in 1895 in Atlanta, Georgia, as a response to the discrimination that Black doctors faced from the AMA, which would not admit Blacks. AMA was organized in 1847, and it wasn't until really relatively recently that Blacks were allowed admission into the AMA. So in the meantime, it was necessary for Black doctors to create their own thing, and they did. So that organization is now over 125 years old and is serving a great purpose from the standpoint of leading Black medicine. I'm going to move on to my conclusion very quickly. This is a picture of Dr. Daniel Hale Williams, a distant relative of mine, who in 1893 did what I recognize as the first operation on the human heart in history in Chicago, Illinois, at his hospital, Provident Hospital, where he sewed up the pericardium of a patient who had been stabbed in the heart and saved his life. And so, of course, we know about a lot of other individuals who've done fantastic work in open heart surgery, pioneers there. But this gentleman should be credited with doing the first operation on the living human heart. Dr. Daniel Hale Williams. Many people don't know about that. They need to. And here's finally a professor from Harvard Medical School who is also unrecognized relatively, William Augustus Hinton, who was a professor at Harvard and wrote the first book on syphilology at Harvard, first book in the United States, which is now in the Smithsonian Institution. And my two books are as well, I'm proud to say. Joined him there. So much more in regards to Black medical heroes. This is Dr. W. Montague Cobb, who was the person who led the fight not only for things like civil rights, but also voting rights, held the Imhotep sessions with all of the presidents, including President Johnson, Kennedy, and so forth, back in the 50s and 60s, 40s as well, at the White House, which led to the positive actions in not only those issues, but also in opening up hospitals, which Vikas is going to be talking about, which were strictly segregated at the time. And Dr. Charles Richard Drew, who is credited with developing blood transfusion and the development of blood plasma for use during World War II. I'll finish with just mentioning what I consider 17 critical events in Black medical history, which have impacted us regarding healthcare delivery. I mentioned already the creation of the American Medical Association in 1847. There was the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision in 1857, which was really very monumental because what that did when Judge Roger Taney made his declaration that Blacks were not the same as whites, physically, et cetera, and could only be recognized as being 3/5 of white men, and therefore not able to receive civil rights, not, as he put it, as Black men, not able to be respected as full men. That led to repercussions down through the years, the decades, which we feel resonating right now. There's the Emancipation Proclamation, the end of the American Civil War, the adoption of the 14th Amendment, giving Negroes full citizenship in 1868. And by the way, let me just mention that it wasn't too many years ago when if you wanted to make a designation of a Black person, you may have had some difficulty. People didn't know what to call us. There were some demeaning expressions that were used early on. And then those evolved. But eventually terms such as Negroes were used, and then eventually Afro-Americans, and now African-Americans. Back in the days when we were at Harvard, you may be surprised to know that the news programs, when they announced news about Blacks in their reports, they always prefaced the Black person's name with Negro. So, for instance, I would be called Negro Al Williams. And in fact, I was at a couple of times when I was subjected to news reports. Well, to move on, there was a creation, as I mentioned, of the National Medical Association in 1895, the Plessy versus Ferguson Supreme Court decision on separate but equal, which was a blockbuster. And I've alluded to the Flexner report in 1910, which was that report that removed all of the Black schools except medical schools, except for Howard and Meharry from existence. Some people thought that was good because the whole purpose was to clean up medicine, so to speak. But I think it went overboard in terms of eliminating a resource for developing an educational resource for developing Black doctors we're still suffering from. Obviously, it was the Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the year after we started college. I could go on and on about that, but some of our classmates were very instrumental in the aftermath of all of that. The Voting Rights Act in 1965, the Civil Rights Act in 1964, affirmative action in 1968, creation of the National Institutes of Health. My goodness, that was monumental in 1972. I've got on here the founding of the Association of Black Cardiologists, which I was responsible for in 1974. The Malone-Heckler Report, which actually identified discrimination and institutionalized racism in medicine. And finally, the Institute of Medicine report, which you've alluded to, and the passage of the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, or the ACA, in 2010 by Barack Obama. Well, it's much more that I wish I could present to you, but time does not permit that. I'll simply mention that Dr. Martin Luther King was very concerned about healthcare disparities himself, and said that of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and inhumane. And there he is in his Nobel Peace Prize awards. My final piece has to do with something that we're dealing with now, and that's the COVID pandemic. And this is an excerpt from Harvard Magazine, which shows this something that you may not be able to see very clearly, but it was very graphic in showing the skin as being the body's largest organ, which deflects danger, heralds disease, and captures sensory stimuli. And in this pandemic, its color might mean the difference between life and death. And I think that that's something that we've been dealing with undercurrently. This, I think, brings it to focus. In 2020, more Black Americans will die of COVID-19 than will succumb to diabetes, strokes, accidents, or pneumonia. In fact, COVID is the third leading cause of death for African Americans. It really has had quite an impact, and shows the disproportionality that Blacks were 3.5 times, and the Latinx community members twice as likely to die from COVID than whites. So therein lies some things that we need to be concerned about. Health equity, which is what I started talking about, you should understand, is a state in which health outcomes and healthcare costs are not determined by race, ethnicity, gender, geographic location, or socioeconomic status. And it's not the same as health equality, which means giving everyone the same opportunities of care, et cetera. Subtle differences, but important ones. And although I can't elaborate on this now, this goes back to something that was developed during Ken Shine's time at the IOM, the definition of what was needed for healthcare improvement. And you can see that health equity is number 1 on the list. There were other things that were done. That today we've developed what we call the quintuple aim of improving population health, enhancing the care experience, reducing costs, eliminating physician burnout, and of course, advancing health equity. So you can see how important health equity is in the mix. And finally, I want to point out to those of you who are involved in industry that there is a business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, or what we call DEI. Here are some meaningful figures that $93 billion in excess care costs are mounted up each year. These are figures from Ernst & Young, who many of you understand and respect. And the cost to industry is $42 billion a year in lost productivity. So dollar signs count. And those of you who understand business realize that there is a particular value in achieving health equity that will percolate in your industry. Okay, well, in conclusion, I've said a little something in our Harvard Latin, res ipsa loquitur, the thing speaks for itself. And I'm sure that all of you understand what that means from the standpoint of the importance of achieving health equity, which will be of benefit for all of us. Thank you very much for allowing me to present this. Now I have the privilege to present our next speaker, who is Dr. Robert Higgins. Dr. Higgins' biography is in your program book, so I will not attempt to read all of it, but you should know that he is the president of Brigham and Women's Hospital here in Boston. He has a long and fine history in medicine and healthcare. He's a card-carrying cardiothoracic surgeon who has such wonderful credentials. I can't go through all of them, but he's here to talk to you about some specific aspects of these issues that we're discussing today that have to do with health equity, diversity, inclusion, and social justice. Bob, would you come to the podium, please?
Thank you. Let's see if we can. Yeah, great. Thank you. Appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to join you today. It really is a pleasure and an honor. And I am never in my wildest imagination would I expected to be in these circumstances at this time. Just a little bit more about my background. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I'm a clinical doctor who has been in practice since 1992. And I carved a career having grown up in New England. Again, my mom and dad met in Nashville at Meharry when my dad was a medical student in the 50s. And then he served in the Navy, and I was born in San Diego in 1958. And they came back to Charleston, South Carolina, where my dad was born, and then he was one of the first underrepresented minority physicians in service to the community. And then unfortunately, in 1964, he was killed in a car accident when I was 5, and my brothers were 3 and 1. And my mom, without any life insurance, was left alone. So we moved back to New York, and we moved in with my grandparents, and they raised us for the next 15 years in a 2-bedroom apartment in upstate New York. I was afforded extraordinary opportunities in that regard. And so I think one of the themes of my comments today, and I'll be brief, is about opportunities. It's one of those things that happened. We were pretty mischievous, 3 young African-American boys in the middle of a tough circumstance. And my mom threatened that if we didn't behave, she would send us to military school. And damn if she didn't do it. So she sent us to this place called the Albany Academy, which was ROTC, and we learned about discipline, but mostly it fully deployed us. You had to play a sport, you had to march in the military, you had to go to class, and you had to get discipline. And so we were fortunate, while she worked a couple of jobs, to benefit from that education, and it's the foundation upon which my academic career has been built. And then I was recruited as an athlete to play in the woods of Hanover at Dartmouth. It was a fantastic experience. Spent a lot of time down here in Cambridge, having fun. And it was a great opportunity. And then I ended up in New Haven in medical school. And so my career was catapulted by lots of people committing to my career and instilling in us the message that it had to be about excellence. And so with that foundation, I'll share some thoughts about what I believe is important in this dialogue about how we serve our communities, serve the population that we care for. Many of you have been patients in the medical system. Some of you at Harvard, some of you at the Brigham and Mass General, great institutions. So I'm honored to be here with you today to share some reflections about that. So I'm going to take a page from Dr. Williams' book and really try to think a little bit about this crisis in U.S. healthcare and taking a closer look at health equity and education. And I'm hopeful that we will be able to find a silver lining in the otherwise dark clouds that prevail around the communities that we live and work in. And again, I'm honored to be, as the president of the Brigham, the first of hopefully a successful tenure in that regard. So one of my favorite movies is The Perfect Storm. And many of you may be familiar with this, but a perfect storm is a particularly bad or critical state of affairs arising from a number of negative and unpredictable factors. And there was a movie about commercial fishermen out of the Boston area you're probably familiar with. George Clooney was in that movie. And of course, my mom and my wife's favorite actor. And so it's about they were commercial fishermen. They went out and they had a confluence of significant problems that occurred. And it was based upon the book written about this challenging set of circumstances. Ultimately, they lost their lives. Well, we're in a bit of a perfect storm right now. As you think about 2020 till now, the COVID pandemic has shocked us. We didn't even know anything about it 3 years ago. It's created significant economic challenges, but it's also unmasked and uncovered significant socio-political issues, which we were not expecting, I don't think. They were behind the scenes, but it's made this a very difficult time, a turbulent time, and a moment in time which we will have to rethink about. It has a significant economic impact, and of course, the political and racial unrest that has occurred in parallel with that makes it really tough. So I'm hopeful we can find a silver lining, and this is my message to my faculty and to our staff. The Brigham now is made up of 22,000 employees, of which I'm the president, and we have responsibility for the academic mission, teaching, research, and education. And it's a daunting task, and thank goodness that I stand on the shoulders of so many qualified and capable people to help run that enterprise. The Brigham is then also, as you probably recently heard, part of the Mass General Brigham health system, where Mass General and the Brigham used to intensely compete. We are now partners, small p, not big P partners, small p partners. And we are building a bridge between the two academic enterprises. So I report to Ann Klebansky, who is the CEO of Mass General Brigham, and the other president, David Brown, and I are great friends, and we are partners between the three of us, and we're building a bridge. The expectation for those of you who are in business and finance, 1 + 1 could actually equal 3 if we make this marriage work. And that's the premise upon which we are building this new enterprise. That leads to 79,000 employees at 16 hospitals, with the 2 academic medical centers being the pillar of support. The other 14 hospitals are the rehab hospital, Faulkner, Ioneer, any number of other. So it's a daunting task to manage a $16 billion enterprise, of which the Brigham contributes $5.4 billion. So it's a extraordinary task, but I love a challenge. And I'm proud to be part of it and honored to be serving. I'm going to spend some time talking a little bit about some of the things that have happened in our environment, which I'm passionate about. And as Dr. Williams pointed out, and I'm sure Rivas is going to talk a little bit about, it is the idea that we can create a better world and that we can create a more diverse and inclusive environment while doing God's work, taking care of patients, training the next generation of physicians and nurses, and ultimately serving the communities in which we reside. But it's a daunting task. And so I'm a fan of history as well. And this famous historian has really helped me understand. It's like deja vu all over again. And you know what deja vu is, right? The feeling that one has lived through the present situation before. And I think that is the circumstances as it relates to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and improving the health equity in our communities. As a person of color in the United States, it has been a challenge. But these are not new phenomenon. As you heard, over 400 years of forced servitude. But in 1918, there was a similar pandemic. And that was really a hallmark moment. It's pretty clear that the experiences of being Black in America is now a point of consternation for all of you, as it is with all of us, primarily because of social media, which shows us things that we didn't necessarily understand about the world. And it really demonstrates that there are human rights violations that are occurring every day. And they happened in 1918 when there were race riots, and then in the 1960s before the Civil Rights Amendment, and now in the 2000s when we worry about George Floyd and all the other things that are happening. It really is a remarkable time in history. And as recently as January, here at the Brigham, I'm on the job for a month. And one of our faculty reported a paper about how people who came to the emergency room with heart failure, they studied to make sure that we were giving the right care for the right patients. And unfortunately, they unmasked a problem that if you were a white person and you had heart failure, you were admitted to the heart failure service with all the expertise and science that was available. But if you were a person of color, you might not get the same level of care. And they reported that in the literature and said, we can fix this and make it equal for everybody, trying to do the right thing. Well, apparently that was misinterpreted by some white supremacists who showed up outside the hospital and said that the Brigham is offering to disadvantage people in the majority because of their race, which was not the message. And the data was pretty clear. And then they called out those two investigators and threatened them. They continue to threaten those people. They call them on the phone and call them bad names. They call them the N-word and tell them all kinds of terrible things about what they're going to do to their families. As recently as last week, these people are terrorizing our physicians. That doesn't seem right. It's crazy. What they did identify was ways for us to improve the equity that we provide the care. They published it in the American Journal, and they looked at about 2,000 patients, and they said, based upon your race, where did you get admitted for heart failure care? And then they ultimately demonstrated that Black and Latinx patients were less likely to be admitted to the cardiology service for heart failure. This inequity could drive worse outcomes. That was their observation. It was a fair observation. We've fixed that. We've now changed it. And so that if you come in with heart failure, you're going to get the same level of care, regardless, Black, brown, purple, green, yellow, man, woman, doesn't matter. We're going to level the playing field. And that's what we're asking for. That's all we're trying to do. And that's my purpose in this role, is to create equity within that. Now, as you've heard, the Institute of Medicine observed these problems long ago. And in 2003, under the direction of Dr. Shine, as you've heard, they identified that racial and ethnic minorities received worse healthcare than non-minorities. And there were both explicit and implicit reasons why that happened. So this is not new for all of us, yet it renews our understanding that life expectancy, if you're a person of color in the United States, is worse than if you are a person in the majority. And this data looks at the life expectancy, age on the y-axis, versus the year. And you see it's getting a little bit better, but still Black and brown folks have much worse survival, regardless of what age they are, over the years. And so that's the problem that we're trying to solve for. And this looks at our country as a heat lamp, right? So it's a heat map. It tells you where is the highest intensity of mortality from cardiovascular disease in the United States. And they said, well, these communities where they have lots of heart attacks, lots of diabetes, lots of hypertension, are at risk for patients dying sooner. And what they also correlated was that there were some social determinants of poor outcomes. And so These are the social determinants of health. And they're not like whether you take your blood pressure medicine or whether you get your diabetes care. It's whether you went to high school, whether you were working, whether you had the resources to pay your rent. So these are things that deter people from getting the care that they need. So they don't have access to care. And that's what we're referring to when we talk about social determinants of well-being. It's not just going to the doctor, it's having the resources to do that. And many of you, I think, could correlate. How expensive are your medications on a regular basis? How hard is it to get to see your primary care or get to a specialist with a new diagnosis of cancer or hypertension or diabetes? So these are the challenges that people face. And if communities don't have economic means, they can't get to those people to get the care they need. We're all fortunate to be well cared for with healthcare resources. A lot of people don't have those resources. So that's what we're trying to do, is level the playing field in terms of health equity. And even if you look at modern surgical care for bypass surgery for heart disease, which is what I did. This is a study that I wrote last year, over 1 million patients, where we studied someone who needed bypass surgery and looked at all the people in the Society of Thoracic Surgeons database, where we have complete information about it. The top of the food tree in terms of great care. And we looked at over 1 million patients and we compared them. And we found out that Black patients had worse outcomes. And in fact, women had worse outcomes. And in fact, the persistence of these problems from 20 years ago till now in a modern series are still there. So we have to improve it for everybody's best interest. Black, white, purple, green, yellow, men, women. So we're trying to elevate the care that we provide. And we published this in the Annals of Surgery. So you have to ask, why do people not get the care or the outcomes that we want? Maybe it's because they don't trust the doctors and they don't go to doctors. Maybe they don't have resources in the hospitals where they get the care. Maybe our patients are less well informed about, this is a highly educated group here. Maybe some people just don't have the information. But maybe it's because we don't have enough people who can provide the care, as Dr. Williams pointed out, who are Black and brown, who work in those impoverished communities, in those tougher environments, not at elite places like Mass General and the Brigham, but in, Dorchester and West Roxbury and Mattapan, where they don't have physicians of color or physicians who are dedicating their time to those people. So maybe our charge would be, if we increase the number of physicians serving those communities, it would help. So that's the mission. And that's hopefully what we're going to try to do. Now, it's pretty clear that if we're going to change the culture of healthcare and the delivery of healthcare and access, we have to do something to make it a supportive environment for students who want to come to our environment. So I've been at places like Hopkins and at the Brigham, and we want to make it so it's a welcoming place. I want people to come up and say, gosh, I love this place. I want to go there, whether you're Black, brown, purple, whatever, man, woman. So we have to create a culture of acceptance and inclusion. And that's what we're trying to do. Because structural racism is that system that promotes not being welcomed, not feeling like this is your home. And that occurs. It's a lack of diversity among medical students and residents and faculty. It's a culture of discrimination. And sometimes it comes across in the academic elitism. People are expecting so much of us here that some people feel inferior. They can't provide that. They don't feel welcome there. And so we have to do something better. There are microaggressions. People kick my tires all the time because they think, well, Higgins, we just hired him because he's a Black guy. Does he really have the chops to do that job? Well, I would dare say my career has been pretty good. And coming from Johns Hopkins, where I was the surgeon in chief, I think I did a pretty good job there. We're the #1 ranked program in the country at Hopkins. And now I'm bringing that experience to Boston. So I think I'm okay. But some people challenge me, and I'm happy for that challenge because we're going to prove them wrong. And we'll do it with a smile and not making them feel bad, but try to make them feel like we are creating a safe zone for Black and brown people to be successful here, and for women, and for people who look different than us in the majority to be successful. So that's the goal. Now, the challenge, of course, is that there are unintended consequences. If we don't create a culture that is great, then people who are successful and smart but feel left out will leave academics. And we preciously need those people to stay in academics, to teach, to guide, to coach, to help take care of the people who don't get the service they need. And this is my colleague, Juanita Merchant. We went to medical school together. Our system needs to be more sensitized to supporting these students so that the Dr. Williamses of this era feel like they belong. And so, again, it's interesting, and I say this with all sincerity, the privilege is invisible to those who have it. For those who have privilege, equality and efforts to create it feels like discrimination. But I'm here to say that justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are affected. And I'm hoping that all of you will agree and join us in this journey. So we're excited. These are tough times, as Martin Luther King, of course, so many great quotes. We hope to carve a tunnel of hope through this dark mountain of disappointment. Some of the racial strife that we face are really challenging times. And the kind of the racism we face, I'm proud to say that the Mass General Brigham is united against racism. This is a platform that we have helped to formulate in the last year. And I'm proud to be a member of that team. And what it is an opportunity for us to address health equity at the level of the patients, but also to help our communities get better outcomes and to create a more diverse workforce. And I think that requires leadership from folks like me, David Brown, and Ann Klebansky. So as we address the disparities, it's an intensive effort. It requires not only targeted research, better public funding for programs, improving access, improving the culture of our environment, but it's also increasing the diversity of our workforce. In the last 5 minutes, I'm going to tell you about how we're trying to increase the diversity of our workforce, some of the work we did in Baltimore, and hopefully we'll do here. Because it's my thesis that it's possible that a more diverse workforce could improve patient care and save thousands of lives of people with cardiovascular disease and cancer and other diseases that are affecting them. So there's lots of literature from the Harvard Business Review, right? And they've looked at programs to try to increase the pipeline of students, working with college students, high school students, creating contact, mentorship opportunities, sponsorship. Professional societies are doing this work. So there is a all intensive environment of support for the students we want to bring into the environment. And we're doing better. This is the data from the Brigham. It looks at the underrepresented minorities in medicine who were recruited from medical school to come train at the Brigham. And last year, we went from 13% the previous year to 26%. So that's a pretty good jump. Now we have to sustain that. And we have to make sure that those people who are here feel like they're welcomed and supported. So this concept of inclusive excellence, lest you thought that we're lowering the bar so that we can let these Black and brown folks in, that is not the case. We are elevating the expectations. And this concept of inclusive excellence is something from the NIH. And it's the recognition that an academic community or an institution's success is dependent on how well it values and engages, promotes, and includes a rich diversity of students, staff, faculty, administration, and alumni. It's what makes us great when we have other ideas and thoughts at the table. So I'm hopeful that that's the case. Now, people coming from very sophisticated environments. And I believe diversity has got to be a key component of that strategy. So that's what we're trying to do. Because this concept of bringing new people in was espoused by one of my mentors, Dr. LaSalle Lafall. Now, he was an African-American surgeon. He was the department chair at Howard University, one of those iconic places where my grandfather got his law degree and my brother went for medical school, and Meharry, those two great places. He was the first person of color to be the president of the American College of Surgeons and the American College of the American Cancer Society at the same time. And he talked about this idea of meritocracy because he firmly believed that excellence of performance was the metric that we had to make sure you could come to environments like this and succeed. And that would transcend the artificial barriers of racism that people put up against us. And so it's all been about excellence in that regard. And I'm proud to say that he instilled that in me, and I'm going to try to pass that along to my kids and to everybody who comes with us. So now here's the call to action for all of you. This concept of allyship. It's the practice of emphasizing social justice, inclusion, and human rights by members of an in-group to advance the interest of an oppressed or marginalized group. And so I think that we all have the ability to be allies. Black, brown, purple, white. We all have the opportunity to serve. It's about creating relationships that are strong and supportive based upon trust and consistency. And they ultimately provide opportunity to grow and to learn about ourselves. So there's also this concept of sponsorship, where I have a responsibility. Once I get into a place of control or power or influence, I have to bring other people along. So I have a group of about 120 students who either are mentored by me or come for rotations, or we have a lecture and we try to make them understand these rules. It's about excellence. But if they're excellent, I can help them get to the next level. So they got to do well in their grades. They got to do well in their tests. They got to perform above and beyond what others do. It's about excellence. We're not lowering the bar, we're elevating it. And that's what I believe is the premise on which we move forward. So my responsibility, and I love this quote, is, and hopefully you'll agree, a leader is great, not because of their power, but because of their capabilities to empower others. And I believe that's our responsibility. It's a quote from John Maxwell, but I think it has a place. And so we've been involved in mentorship activities. This is some of the stuff we did at Hopkins, where we had groups of students come, high school students, college students, and they participated. And I'm really proud of this group. They were high school sophomores. And in Baltimore, the graduation rate was 62% from high school. What could you do in this world without a high school degree? But we took these students who were interested in science, and we said, come on Saturdays and we'll do prep tests for your ACT and your next level college. And all of these students, 100% got into degree conferring schools. Now, there were a select group, and there were about 25 of them each year who came, spent their Saturdays and studied, and then got great SAT scores. And they all got into college. And so now we stay in touch. I went to one kid's graduation last weekend from Dickinson College. He actually got invited to be a member of the Board of Trustees as a student graduate. So proud of her. And yet that's where we got to go. So with that, I think I'll conclude. It starts early. These are a group of first graders that we said, you can dream for whatever you want. We got them white coats. And he said, you can be a doctor, but it's going to take a long time and you got to be dedicated to it. And we try to instill in them that sense that they could accomplish something. It's something about what you can believe you can be in order to be successful. And so my wife, of course, helped to conceive of that idea. So she gets credit. I got to give her credit. I thought it was pretty cute. And I said, we got to take a picture of this. And so it's investing early in those who are underrepresented. These are some of the students in our resource group at Hopkins. They're all medical students and graduates who are going to go on to be great doctors, some of them coming here to the Brigham and Harvard. It's about recruitment. It's about retaining them. It's about professional leadership and development. And ultimately, it's about making them feel like they belong in these environments. And so with that, I'll close and say that justice is not only the absence of racism, but it's the presence of opportunity and success that we hope to achieve. And that's obviously a quote from Barack. So thank you for your time. And I look forward to the panel discussion as we go forward. So thanks.
Well, we'll continue to roll right along to conclusion. We'll bring up our next speaker. And at the end of his presentation, we'll have a brief period for Q&A so that you will get a chance to interact with us and not only make comments, but ask questions about some of the things that we presented. So at this time, our next presenter is Dr. Vikas Sinai, who's going to be talking to you about whatever he wants to talk to you about regarding hospitals. He's the president of the Lown Institute, and he'll tell you what the Lown Institute is and who Dr. Professor Bernard Lown was. You need to know about him if you don't already know about him. And Dr. Vikas Sinai is a cardiologist and has a private practice in cardiology, as well as heading this tremendous forward-seeking institute under the name of Dr. Bernard Lown. You can read a lot more about him in your program, and he can tell you a lot more about what his intent is to change the face of health equity in this country. Vikas?
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. The morning is late. I'm tempted to ask you all to stand up and let the blood circulate, being the cardiologist that I am, but I won't. Take 30 seconds. Hey, thanks.
Yeah.
Great. So as you heard, I'm a clinical cardiologist. Probably it's helpful to know a little bit about me. Let me just share the following. I came to this country when I was 4 years old from India. Both my parents came to get their PhDs at Ohio State, in fact. So I was a Buckeye fan in my early years. Then I grew up in middle school and high school in Canada, and then came south to college, studied philosophy at Princeton, and then went back to Canada to medical school. And after that, I came south. I think the theme of the movie Good Will Hunting says it all. I came south chasing a girl. And so I ended up at Hopkins and then came to Boston to work with Dr. Lown. And there's stories upon stories I could tell you about all of that, but we just don't really have time. But that's who I am. And I lead the Lown Institute these days on an issue that I think is fundamental, which is the nature and structure of our hospital and hospital care in relationship to the wider problems of healthcare. But I was thinking about you all when you were in college, and I realized, there was a lot going on. So listening to Jim talk about all the changes at Harvard, these days, over that period of time, you already heard about Brown versus Board of Education, Emmett Till, Rosa Parks, and then after graduation, I guess the Little Rock Nine, but that was a tumultuous time. And there were a lot of changes that emerged from that kind of mobilization, upheaval, if you will. And of course, a lot of it spun out of control in later years with assassinations and the like. But this is an interesting class. The sociology of that period in America is an interesting time. And I've always had a little bit of the immigrant perspective on all of this. But in some ways, this was sort of the golden age of the post-war era with all the problems it had. And now there's no question we face a lot of challenges. Coming from my background, my impulse is to say there's a lot of collected wisdom in this room. There is a lot of experience. And one thing we as a society really don't do well is to really capture that and put it to use. So I would encourage all of you to think about that many of you probably already are contributing in many ways, but there's no doubt we could use everything that you have to offer. So let me just start with that. There's been a lot of changes, but some things really haven't changed. And, you know, this is a beautiful mural of George Floyd. This is painted on the Berlin Wall. This is something that captured the attention of the entire world. And in some ways, the problems we have in this country are reflected in many other countries. So the challenges, if we can meet them, are also opportunities for us to provide leadership worldwide. I know that sounds kind of grandiose these days, but let me state it as such. But I want to talk to you about structural racism, because really, I think we need to pull back a little on the lens to try to understand what it is we face. And I'll share a little bit of data with you from our work that I think begins to illustrate some of the issues. You know, what the hell is water? When you're swimming in it, it's hard to see it. And it really takes effort. And disruptions like the Black Lives Matter movement, other movements that spread throughout the country are these moments that allow us to step back. And I think that's why we're here. And I think that's really why we have this topic today. So I just want to point out that there is a lot of interest just in the last 2 weeks in medical journals. This is JAMA Network Open. They've had a whole series. When you start looking at any individual piece of this complicated puzzle of the American healthcare system, you will find racial disparities, right? Not a surprise when you think about it, but the fact that these things are being published indicates there is now a moment, and these are the things that are drawing a lot of attention. I'm not going to go through all of these studies. This is really not the purpose of this talk, but mostly to tell you there is a lot of interest. And if you go to proton beam therapy or epidural blood patches or GI tract cancer, wherever you look, there are issues. But in some ways, I'm exploring these with you mostly to say, there are systemic issues that we begin to need to talk about, because otherwise we may miss the forest for the trees. So let me just talk a little bit about what that looks like, the way I am thinking about it. So this is a busy slide. You don't really need to look at it. It's mostly a cheat sheet for me. But when we start looking at disparities, one of the things we begin to see is that a lot of it is not at the individual level. Sometimes Black-white differences in care are much, much less. And what matters is where you're getting the care. And there's a body of work now that points to that fact. And so the reality is quite often the higher surgical mortality rates of Black patients, or the higher, cardiovascular care rates of Black patients, are attributable as best as we can with a lot of research information and statistical methods, attributable to where they're getting their care, and less about an individual difference at the point of care between patients. I'm not saying those don't exist, because they do, but a lot of the disparities are more structural. And you see it in everywhere. So this is just a quick study on transfer rates, and the fact that in diagnoses where it's known that people benefit from a transfer, you will see the systematic pattern in which the locus of care, the transfer from one hospital to another, there are differential rates, even after you try to account for as many confounding factors as you can. But then the other side of this is there's a lot of concentration of care. This is from Ashish Jha. He was at Harvard now. Now he's he was at Brown. Now he's at the White House. He's the COVID czar. But Ashish, published this years ago, and really it illustrates that a lot of hospital care for Black patients in this country is really concentrated to a small number of hospitals. So we at the Lown Institute wanted to look at hospital care. So we began this project many years ago, and we began it really inspired by our founder, Bernard Lown. Now, Dr. Lown was a remarkable figure, an amazing figure. I didn't know the half of it when I left Hopkins to come here. But I'll tell you the story. I wasn't going to come here. I just planned to stay at Hopkins. I had a cardiology fellowship, an MPH, all lined up, fully funded. I just wanted to do certain kind of research that only he had been doing. And I wanted to learn the techniques and go back. So I said, can I come for 3 months? And he said, no. I said, no, you don't understand. I'm not stupid. I had an extra pair of hands. I'm fully funded. I'm sure it would be helpful. No. And then I said, well, I don't get it. He says, the only way you can come to my lab is if you are my fellow. And I left Hopkins and came to Harvard about 3 months before the start. So people at Hopkins were not thrilled, but they conceded that, well, if it's Bernard Lown, we can't blame you. Dr. Lown got kicked out of Hopkins briefly for having transfused a Black man's blood into a white man, a Southern white man, it turned out. And so Bernard was really quite a figure, but I was reminded that one of his contributions with Samuel Levine early on in the 50s was precisely this change, 6 weeks of bed rest after a heart attack. And when he did that with Dr. Levine, there was pandemonium because it was considered so irresponsible and iconoclastic and dangerous. Whereas in fact, what we know now is we probably saved hundreds of thousands of lives from blood clots and all sorts of things when you lay in bed for 6 weeks. So very early on, he wasn't afraid to make those kinds of changes. And we like to think at the Lown Institute that we have some of that DNA, and that's part of what we've been trying to do with the Hospitals Index. We see the Hospitals Index as at the center of these 3 pillars that for us represent a fundamental aspect of our work in trying to improve the American healthcare system. And I don't think there's any debate anywhere in the country, left, right, center, that wouldn't agree the healthcare system in this country needs work. So we publish this on a regular basis. This will be the 3rd year. There's a website, and you're free to go and take a look there. It's lownhospitals.org. And we do a lot of interesting work. It's gotten noticed. It's gotten a lot of notice. In the middle of the pandemic, we were concerned going live in the middle that we wouldn't get much attention, but the opposite was really true, partly because of some of the disparities that have emerged and sort of come to the fore in terms of national consciousness, partly because the impact of COVID and everyone's recognition that healthcare and healthcare system is central to all of our lives in a way that before COVID was harder for many people to recognize. So that coverage has continued both in the lay press and in the medical press. And exactly, technology once more. We transferred from the Mac to the Wintel machine, and all that formatting just disappeared. But what we have, what we publish is the Hospital Social Responsibility Index, but what it has within it are these 3 pillars: equity, value, and outcomes. And within those, there are a lot of individual metrics. And I'm not going to go through them all, but I'm going to point you to the far left, which is inclusivity, because that's one I want to talk about. But let me just say, this is a method of looking at hospitals that did not really exist before we did this. We include things that no one's ever included before. If you look in the middle, things like unnecessary care, which, don't get me started. I mean, the amount of unnecessary care in American healthcare is a scandal. How much is it is the debate, but it's not millions, it's billions, and it's not even tens of billions. It's more like at least 100 billion. So there are elements of the healthcare system that we measure and report on, but I'm going to talk mostly about inclusivity. What I want you to understand is we use claims data. And what we do is we try to understand a map of a hospital. So we look at the hospital and we say, where do patients come from to this hospital? And this is a map of a hospital in Philadelphia. It's Pennsylvania Hospital. And these are all the zip codes that are around the hospital, and patients come to this hospital from all these zip codes. This being 2022, we got to use computers and fancy algorithms and math and big data and all that stuff. We do that. But in the end, there's an algorithm that lets us define a perimeter that says, beyond this, there aren't that many additional patients that come. And so we're going to define this as the boundary of the hospital. Then we look inside that boundary and we say, where are Medicare patients coming from? And it's interesting that it's Medicare. We can talk at length about that because it's not about the money, right? The money's the same. The hospital's getting paid the exact same amount. These are where the patients come from. And you'll see disproportionately for this hospital, there's about 7 zip codes south of the hospital that disproportionately send patients. But they come from elsewhere. The grayed out areas, they're also sending patients. So that gives us a sense of what's the patient profile that this hospital serves within this perimeter. But now let's look at the demographics. And in this instance, it'll be the demographic of the percent of Black patients in these zip codes. And there you have it. And what you see is almost a negative image. What you see is, in fact, that the zip codes that send a lot of patients to the hospital are, in fact, some of the zip codes that have the lesser amount proportion of Black residents. And it's not about distance, because if you look north of the hospital, not very far, there are several zip codes that are very heavily weighted towards Black residents. And, we can make it even clearer. It's almost like a hand in glove. So what is this? What is this about? Well, like I said, it's not really about money in the moment. Payment is exactly the same. Why does somebody go to one hospital or another? Or why do hospitals have patients coming from one place and not another? These are big, big questions. But when we start looking at that and we look at different elements, we can tabulate it. We can look at education, income, racial composition. And in that way, we have a difference calculation. What's the difference between who's coming to the hospital and who's around in the community? And that difference is a bit of a measure. In fact, when I first started thinking about this 4 years ago, before the pandemic, I coined the term hospital social distance, because it's a distance from the community in a sense, a demographic distance. But once the pandemic hit, we said, we can't use that word anymore. It means something else. So we call it inclusivity, which is, I think, pretty reasonable as well. It turns out you can do this in any city in America, and we're happen to be in Cambridge, so why not? Let's look at Cambridge. And so this is Mount Auburn versus what's now called Cambridge Health Alliance, though back in the day it was Cambridge City Hospital. These are all, much bigger. And you see that, they're about 2 miles apart. They have overlapping catchment areas. Mount Auburn is in the pink. It certainly has a larger catchment area, and that's not really surprising. The inner circles are the 50th percentile, just to give you a sense of the skew. And then when we start looking at some of the demographics, these are the zip codes, and you can again see the zip codes. They're not identical, but there's a significant overlap. And those of you who know Boston and the sociology of Boston, further out you go, you're getting into, it's like much of America in the cities. The further out you go, you're going to have a demographic change, you're going to have a racial change, you're going to have an income change. And so some of that you would expect differences, but look at the amount of overlap. And so what we do is we look, so here's inclusivity by income. And on the left is Cambridge Health Alliance, their catchment area income calculated from the census data. And on the right is Mount Auburn, which is now part of the Beth Israel system. And they're not that far apart, but Mount Auburn has a little bit higher income in its catchment area. But these are the patients, and you see this pattern in which, Mount Auburn, the income is actually, of the inpatients, is actually a bit higher than their catchment area. For Cambridge Health, the income of their patients is actually lower than their catchment area. And remember, the catchment area, there's a lot of overlap. This is the pattern we see. At the Lowndes Institute, we call this a tale of two hospitals. Every city has it. And this is inclusivity in terms of Black patients. And what you'll see, the catchment area roughly the same, 9% in purple. And for Cambridge Health, it's just a little bit higher, 11. And for Mount Auburn, it's a little bit lower. I mean, this is not bad compared to what you see in other parts of the country, but this is the pattern. And it's interesting, we can look, and we do look at Hispanic or Latinx, and here is where Cambridge Health is actually not kind of over-serving that community. So we're actually thinking this metric may have some value to people as they think about what they do at a hospital, where they put the next clinic, what their mission is, how they want to advertise, all sorts of things. Like I said, we can do the same for many other hospitals. I won't belabor the point, but this is just New York. New York Health and Hospitals, Lenox Hill. Those of you who know New York will understand exactly what this is going to show. There's the community area demographics. This is, again, I think, inclusivity by race. I think it's Black population. And so you see that, in fact, Lenox Hill, by virtue of where it is, actually has a catchment area that has a substantially higher proportion of minorities in the catchment area. But when you look at the patient populations, it's completely the opposite. So there's a selection going on. Well, this is not a surprise. Is anybody surprised by this? It's not a surprise. But what it does is it illustrates deep things, which is what I would call the structural things. It's the water we're swimming in. It's the air we breathe. It's really stuff we all grew up with because it's history coming. It's just sort of coming from the past. We inherit it, we live it, but we have to question it. And that's part of our goal. If we were coming from Mars, or if we were coming from somewhere else, would this make any sense? Or to put it a different way, would we build 2 airports the way we locate hospitals? And would one of them mostly serve Black people flying and other would serve mostly white people flying? Is there anything more nuts than that? But that's kind of what we've had, and it's not anybody's fault. This is the history that we've inherited. It's a history of slavery. It's also a history of how we do insurance in this country. And I think this is, for me, where we have to end up, all of us, Black, white, purple, brown, however you want to think about it. Because the structural pieces that lead to these kinds of things have to do with residential segregation, segregation of the labor market, the way we link healthcare insurance coverage to your job, which really doesn't make a lot. It worked until it didn't, but it really is not working now. And nothing could prove that more than COVID. You lose your job. Really, you're not going to have health coverage because the economy shut down? Of course, our Congress, and I was quite surprised by this, our Congress, both sides of the aisle, stepped up to the plate, which is what they had to do. And I think they bowed to reality. So there are things we can all do, things that we need to do that have to go deeper and farther than maybe we have expected or anticipated. And I think all of us, including all of you, should be part of that search for solutions. I'll stop there. There's plenty to say.
Thanks very much for a very stimulating presentation, Vikas. We're going to roll right along to our conclusion, if that's all right with everyone. But before we have concluding remarks, we're going to have about 5 minutes of Q&A in regards to the presentations that were made. And this will give you a chance to ask questions directly to any of us and also for us to interact with you. So without further ado, are there any questions that anyone would like to ask? We have people in the audience with microphones that can bring them to you. Right over here. Can you identify
Yeah.
yourself?
I'm Judith Hyman, and I'm the widow of a Harvard classmate, and I was in the same class. We met freshman week of freshman year and then married at the end of our junior year, spent our senior year as married students with John's former roommates basically moving in with us. At any rate, I'm very committed to the Harvard Radcliffe experience, but what strikes me is my waking up to this problem happened in high school, and that's where it should happen. I went to Hunter College High School, which was one of LaGuardia's works of genius, where everybody got in, all they knew about you was your gender, if that mattered, and your score. They didn't know anything else about you. And we all met as equals, and several of my classmates or schoolmates were Black. One of them was Audre Lorde, about who it's recently been said that she is to rage what Monet is to water lilies. And she introduced me to the fact that Schrafft's had hostesses whose jobs were to keep people out who were her color. That was my first awareness of it. And that woke me up, and that got me interested in the encampment for citizenship with ethical culture did, and the folk movement, which with people like Seeger was interested in that. And I think it really is the place where you need to go, because you're reaching people who are just beginning to form their ideas about life and bonding. And by the time they get to college, it's often too late. Get them young.
Get them young. Agreed. Thank you so much for those comments.
Thank you.
I completely agree. On the other hand, it's never too late.
I'm Jack AFG, class of 57, and my wife Sheila is with me. I'm a retired medical oncologist, and Sheila's a retired nurse in a sense, but we're still very active in community service. What we've been talking about today is the fifth element of one of the slides that was presented here. And I think Dr. Robert Higgins has introduced what I think perhaps 5 years from now, from those of us who are lucky enough to be still here and talking about health, would be the next element. And I think he provided us the gateway to that. And Sheila and I were at the Brigham and Women's Hospital a couple of days ago, working with Dr. Cosgrove, a very gifted neurosurgeon, about a problem that she has with intention tremor. And while we were there, we ran into a pamphlet, and it talked about this new president of the hospital. And I actually copied this because, Dr. Higgins, I didn't know you were going to be on this program 2 days ago. So, and this is the quote you said, "You can overcome anything, but you must invest in yourself and do something with your mind and your heart." And to me, that's the gateway to personal agency, to mentoring people to believe in themselves and that they harbor, no matter what their origins, what their social environment has been, what their race, color, creed, or anything else, that if you take the responsibility for believing in yourself and moving forward, if you can find, and if we can have another social determinant of health is mentoring of people to empower them to take themselves forward individually and collectively. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. Well, my mom would be proud. She instilled that in us. And appreciative of the call out. Again, never thought that I would say anything so inspiring on the fly on that interview, but I think it's been what our mantra is, many of us from Dr. Williams' time until now. We just have to continue to, I think, be role models and have opportunities. So that's, I appreciate your calling that out. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I'm from
A
New York, so
question?
I'm very interested in the study in particular between Lenox Hill and Metropolitan. And I wonder if you have more information about that. For example, the outcome, difference in outcomes or complications, that kind of thing.
Yeah, there's lots of data that we have. I don't have it at my fingertips, but we'll be happy to talk offline about it. You know, we do publish outcomes data on that website for all these different hospitals. We haven't done a systematic comparison. We have about 53 metrics, and the interrelationship of all of them to each other is a work in progress. So yes.
I might add that documenting the challenges is not hard. Finding the solutions is the critical challenge. And the data that was presented is not new for many of us. It's contemporaneous and current, and probably will continue in the future unless we find some solutions. And that's the biggest challenge, I think, to innovate new strategies to provide access, improve outcomes, and to level the playing field. And I think that's the big question and challenge.
There are other questions here.
My name is Jessica Hammond.
Can you speak up a little?
I'm Jessica Hammond. I'm a Harvard 63, but I'm married to Ed Rold, who's a member of your class. And I just have a simple informational question. You mentioned the disparities in transfers of Black and white patients when they needed transfer for care. And it seemed to me that that wasn't clearly just structural, that disparity, and I wondered about that.
Yeah, that in particular, I would agree with you. It's not structural. When we look at individual clinical decision making, you know, there's a host of factors that are going to come in. You know, implicit bias for sure. You'd have to think about that. I misspoke if I presented that as an example of structural racism. I wouldn't say it is.
Is anyone, I'm Nancy Johnson, class of 57. Is anyone doing any research into the impact of the federal reimbursement structure on all of this? Because the difference between how we pay for Medicaid patients and how we pay for Medicaid patients is enormous and has a big impact on what hospitals are able to provide. It is already almost totally segregated. I think this is true. I have a much narrower base of knowledge at this point in my life than I did, but the nursing home population, because you have to really structure your whole institution to the Medicaid treatment if you're going to survive. So this would be an ideal time. All of these reimbursement systems are about to collapse. That's why you see this big emphasis on the Advantage plans, because it doesn't involve the detail that the federal structure does. And all the talk about a national healthcare plan couldn't possibly occur on the current structure of payments. So how has work been done on that? How is that encouraging or discouraging what you're trying to accomplish? And it was a wonderful presentation by each of you.
Thank you. Well, you point out a really critical element of this, and we could spend the next hour or two talking about it. But the bottom line is that it's a shame that the economics and the expenses related to healthcare provision is so closely aligned with equity and disparities. That's the biggest challenge. But in the hospital, if you're a Medicaid patient, you get reimbursed. The hospital gets reimbursed at a fraction of what a Blue Cross Blue Shield premium plan would reimburse. And so it creates a perverse incentive for some hospitals to provide exclusive care for those who have better insurance plans. And likewise, it disadvantages those programs that may be in underserved communities that serve a more less diverse insurance population, and they have a higher Medicaid population, and they are under-resourced. And so it's a self-perpetuating process. Now, in Maryland, for instance, where I came from, there was a global budgeted revenue system that all hospitals, irrespective of insurance status, got paid the same for the care that they provided. And it was allocated twice a year based upon an average of revenue over the previous 3 years. And you only got that amount of money for all payers, for all patients. And it was a very equitable system. Now, the challenge with that is it doesn't provide enough revenue to support education and research. And so the hospitals in Maryland, like Hopkins, had to find other means to have revenue to support the mission of education and research. And thank goodness they have a very strong philanthropy program. And folks like Michael Bloomberg, who've given billions of dollars to Hopkins, because he's a Hopkins grad, to help keep that system going. So it's a trade-off. And many of these hospitals, I'm sure Vikas can probably provide data. Hospitals that are rich have resources and they can reinvest in better care and they can provide the care. And hospitals that are in a kind of lower socioeconomic status environments don't have the resources. And many community hospitals are fighting the battle as well. It's not just in the inner city. So Massachusetts had the real challenge with community hospitals being able to maintain their financial success and viability because they're under-resourced and the expenses are going up. So it's a complicated economic situation. Unfortunately, it has significant impact on health equity, as we've heard today.
Thank you. I'd like to solicit a comment from someone in your audience, and that's Dr. Mike Klein. In particular, in reference to Dr. Lown and the experiences that you and I had with him back in the day at the Brigham, just to give us some reflection on how important an individual he was and how important he was in our lives and subsequently in the lives of people now through the operation of the Lown Institute. Do we have a microphone that could be brought down here to Dr. Klein? Sorry to put you on the spot, Mike.
You and Vikas in the audience, he was really a multi-dimensional figure. One memory
Can't hear you,
comes
Mike.
to mind
Give him a better mic. A mic for Mike.
It was really a multi-dimensional figure and one visual memory. Can you hear that?
Yeah.
One visual memory of him was at 2 a.m. in Building 1 of the Harvard School of Public Health, riding his bicycle while we were churning out a research grant for the National Heart Institute on sudden cardiac death. Another dimension of him really was on his daily rounds in what I would call the old Brigham, before it became Brigham and Women's
The
Hospital.
Lown rounds.
Which you and I remember,
Right.
was that on morning rounds, there were 2 individuals that we had to interview and see how they were doing. One was a formidable man of Germanic background who was the principal conductor of both the Boston Symphony and the Pittsburgh Symphony orchestras. And he was handled with, shall I say, respect, deference, and an element of firmness. Another gentleman was a unfortunate man with valvular heart disease, a denizen of Mission Hill, who suffered the ravages of the lower echelons socioeconomically that all three of you have addressed in one way or another. And he was treated with insight, sympathy, empathy, and a reflection of an individual who had the capacity to really interrelate with the high and mighty, the lowly, and try to achieve the best for all. I might ask one question, if I might, of all three of you. Because of the global strife going on now and the economic repercussions for this, in my own practice, what's happening is there's a increment in food insecurity. So could any of you address, you spoke of getting at medical exposure and young people, giving them educational opportunities. What in your programs have led to social outreach to deal with food insecurity? Do you advocate or have you activated programs for food pantries or urban farming?
There are programs like that throughout the country. Unfortunately, not enough. I know of several, but that's something that needs to be expanded because that's at the very root of what we call the social determinants of health. And food and nutrition is really at the center of that. You might say at the heart of it. So you're right on target there. Anyone else want to comment on that?
My comment might be a bit contrarian in the sense that, or old-fashioned perhaps, and that is, I believe that the healthcare system, hospitals in particular, needs to take care of sick people. And that the issue of food insecurity, housing insecurity, many other things have been left at the doorstep of the healthcare system because the rest of society has done nothing. So it's really something that we have to address much more broadly than medicalizing it. So that's my view.
And I would argue that while I agree that the healthcare system is not empowered or does not have the financial wherewithal to provide for all of our communities, we do have a partnership with many in Mission Hill, Dorchester, certainly in the Longwood area to try to help. Because I do think that there's a nexus between providing healthier options and health maintenance and avoidance of acute care in our setting. So we invest, well over $1 million in trying to help our community find some of these resources to be healthier. So it's a wellness concept, I think, that we're trying to nurture, understanding that we can't do it all. And it's a combined government and society's responsibility.
Well, it certainly takes a village, no question about it. But I want to point out too that large organizations have been getting involved. The American Heart Association has a huge program now in doing exactly what you mentioned, Mike. And that's being expanded all the time. So that's another avenue of approach.
I think we should put it off at this point, although I know that other questions that we
I
have.
certainly agree. Jim, did you want to come up and close us out?
No, I'm going to do it from here. We have some gifts for our copy of the essay book.
Great.
Each of you two. It's 1,066 pages. 130 essays.
Wow.
And on all sorts of subjects, and I think we might try reading some of that.
Great.
Anyway, thank you both much. Well, we together enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Lunch is next at Philip Brooks' house over there. We'll be led over there.
We need to have Ann announce everything.
Great
Well,
job.
thanks very much, everyone.
We get together. Yeah, we should talk and share the data. We should share the Boston data. I want to see it so we can